You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Okay, I know we zigzag a little here on this show. Sometimes we talk about the news. Sometimes we talk about how to think about the news. Let's turn a little bit to that. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a scholar, a writer, an educator of America, really, about the risks, the habits, the state of mind of authoritarian leaders. It's been her study since before, but she wrote Strongman, Mussolini to the Present, a fabulous book, and she's taken that learning and dug deep into, unfortunately, fertile ground of current American politics. Welcome back, Ruth.
Thank you.
Americans, I think, are so naive about what democracy is. We tend to think about it only as a matter of voting, but it's so much more. Power's got to be balanced. Accountability has to be on offer. The judiciary needs to be independent. These are things that, our founders spent a lot of time worrying about, but you've shown us that these are precisely the things that autocrats regularly undermine. I guess we're naive about what fascists are, too.
Yeah, well, and what was one thing that was interesting is I wrote Strongmen as an American, first generation, very dismayed because Trump was taking our rights away, and clearly was, in my view, was an authoritarian. And so I wanted to look back at 100 years and see where he fit in. But what I discovered is that every society that has lost its freedoms has been unprepared when people like Mussolini, then Hitler, and even in coups, of course, you're not prepared at all as the public. And every society's had to grapple with the fact that they took for granted their rights. And it's the process of being threatened by the loss of those rights that in some cases, can fuel some societies and fuel resistance movements and fuel reform movements, and they're able to turn back autocracy. Other times it takes living with a dictatorship for some years.
Yeah, well, we're in that moment where we see rising autocracy, we see rights being eroded, and thank goodness, probably because of your efforts and lots of people's efforts, there is a response to it, a fighting back. I think it's helpful, though, to dig in a little deeper and understand it still better. Why do autocrats hold elections? I mean, Turkey, Hungary, Thailand. What do these elections do for the autocrats? And what can we learn from Erdogan's win in Turkey?
Yeah, I wrote a piece. I have a Substack newsletter called Lucid, and my latest piece is about the Turkey elections, which were very, very instructive and sad for me as a fan of democracy. So today we are in an age that's where there's something called electoral autocracy. Electoral autocracy, and that is when sure you still have some places, North Korea and many other places, you don't have elections. But today, when people come to power via elections, it's less common for them to get rid of elections. Instead, they keep them going, and they kind of game the field. They do, they take over the media, they take over the judiciary. It's called autocratic capture. They capture the institutions so that they manage to, even though they permit an opposition, and so that's another way that this is different than 20th century dictatorships. You have an opposition, but the sitting autocrat makes it very, very difficult for that opposition to prevail.
Yeah, so, I grew up, my formative years in thinking about politics when I was a very young, little boy, really, were with Richard J. Daley's Democratic Machine in Chicago. And no one else could win. It didn't matter how the voting went. It was very hard to win. And everybody said, what is this democracy we have? And there were a lot of reform efforts. It took a long time. And he didn't control the courts. He just controlled a huge patronage army. And, of course, set primaries in February when nobody in their right mind would go out and vote in Chicago.
Yeah, so we have a long history of racially motivated voter suppression. And so right now it's interesting because all of that heritage, that domestic heritage, which has been going on in places like Ohio, David Pepper, the former chair of the Democratic Party, has been saying for some years that Ohio is not a functioning democracy in its state government. It's like an autocracy. And this heritage from history, American history, is meeting up with, people like Trump and even DeSantis. They're meeting with Orban of Hungary. Trump is very close with Erdogan, so these are people who have mastered electoral autocracy. And sadly, once they get in power, it means that they don't leave. And so in the recent Turkish elections you asked about, Erdogan he's domesticated most of the media. The opposition had a 6-party coalition and they even got some of the Kurdish parties who usually don't want anything to do with, they're very oppositional. They even got them to play in the opposition coalition. But Erdogan did a typical electoral autocracy thing. The only man who could have beat him is the very popular and much younger mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu. And to get rid of him, to make sure he couldn't be a candidate, Erdogan accused him of insulting politicians and put a jail sentence on his head, a multi-year jail sentence. Now, he didn't send him into jail because that would have caused enormous protest. He kept it hanging over his head, so that disqualified him from being a candidate. And instead, they chose a candidate who was much older, doesn't have the charisma, and who actually moved to the far right and became very anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, which is not good in my book. So that's an example where Erdogan was ever able to keep this guy out of the political field. So that's an example of gaming the competition. Yep. And that's what they do without having to ban elections altogether.
Yeah, it gives them a sense of legitimacy that isn't real, but they guess they get to claim, hey, I won an election. And it's...
Yes, and in the case of and Erdogan's also often saying, "I'm not a dictator. We have elections." And in the case of Orban in Hungary, he still gets EU money. He depends on EU money. Whereas if he got rid of elections and became an old-fashioned dictator, he'd be kicked out. I think there's argument to kick him out anyway, but that I'm very hard line on these things. So there are many reasons that these people engage in electoral autocracy, and that's what the GOP is trying to do here now.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've been clear that there's a personality type common to authoritarian leaders. Now you're not making some psychodeterminist judgment, but as I read your stuff, you're sort of saying that the personality traits of the autocrat and the required traits of the personality cults around them reinforce each other with terrible consequences. So I wonder if you could dig into that a little and then talk about how do you break that connection?
Yeah, that's a good thing to talk about now, because what I do in my book is look at the personality traits that translate into how they govern. So, for example, they're all amoral. They will say and do anything that gets them to power and lets them stay in power. So they often change their opinions of things. You have this right now with Trump, where he was, very against public health measures, against masks, and now he's trying to take advantage for the vaccine program he had, so he's all pro-vaccine. So you're going to see him flip-flopping a bit. They have a mania of controlling others. Loyalty and not competence becomes the most important thing. That's really important because that's why these governments are so horrible and destructive, because competence is not actually prized. It's more loyalty. And we're seeing this and how this has affected the Russian military and all of that dysfunction, which has been revealed to the world. People thought the Russian military was great. It was totally corrupt. It's kleptocracy because Putin is stealing. That's another trait of these people. They're completely corrupt, and so you don't have anybody who tells the truth to the leader. And so over time, they make terrible decisions that have, very bad outcomes for their entire societies. So the personality in this case, we don't have to, I don't use psychological terms in the book. I don't talk about narcissists, but a lot of them are. But you can look at the practical outcomes of how the personality dysfunction affects people, much larger circle of people than just him and his family.
Yeah, and then the group of supporters reward those very traits. They are drawn to them, so the autocrat, I guess, leans into the very worst because it somehow resonates with this personality cult. Yes,
and there's two things here. One is, so for example, if we look right now at the GOP, the race for the GOP nomination, Trump is not a conventional politician. Not only is he an authoritarian, but he is a cult leader. And I have an essay from a few weeks ago in my Substack, Lucid. He is a cult leader, and he's running his campaign as a cult leader. The nature of the bonds with his followers are not those of regular voters. They are cult followers. And they're, as we've seen, through it all, the guy's been out of office for years. He's still incredibly popular because the bond is a cult follower bond. So that's really important. But in terms of trying to be as extreme as possible, we see DeSantis, who is, going to he's way out of whack with the desires of the voters, with his, abortion bans and everything else. But this is where we go back to electoral autocracy. The GOP knows its positions are way out of touch with what voters believe, even centrist voters, even some Republicans. They don't care because they think they're into election denialism. They think they're going to be able to manage power and have power without free and fair elections. So if elections are not the way things are decided, you don't have to care what your policies are.
Right. I mean, I've thought about this, not certainly not anywhere near with the clarity and wisdom that you've thought about it. But I remember thinking, my gosh, what bigger power is there than to be able to say, don't believe your eyes. It's not daytime, it's night. And have a million people believe you. I mean, Donald Trump told people the facts that you see every day, that everybody has confirmed aren't facts. Believe me instead. And they did. That is an enormous power to have over people.
Yeah, and when we look back and we see, and it's not just fascism, also communism, like how could people have believed these things? How could they not have known that, Stalin was starving millions, or the Nazis were persecuting, millions, and the fascists too? We see how people can be led, and even in a democracy this is what's extraordinary about the U.S. case. Those were closed societies where there was absolutely no opposition press, nothing. Anybody who had any contrary view was in prison or exile. We have a fully, free press. We're allowed to, post on social media. And even in that open society, Trump is so skilled as a propagandist and so charismatic in the way of a demagogue that he got 40 million people to believe that he won the election. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, and it's an enormous power over which he has no sense of right and wrong. It's all being used to stroke his own ego, which I guess is the type you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's why his latest thing is, he just congratulated the leader of North Korea. The people he admires and wants to be like are the amoral, violent, corrupt authoritarians. North Korea, not only is a dictatorship, it actually is its main product economically is cybercrime. And a lot of these, I would like, I will write more on this, but I wish more people would write about this. Many of these authoritarian states, including Putin's, which is a fully realized kleptocracy, they are actually criminal entities. And so when Trump is congratulating the leader of a cybercrime syndicate that's masquerading as a government, because that's what it is at this point, because he's an international criminal himself. He's a money launderer. Mm-hmm. There are things he does domestically, sexual assaults to women, but there's a whole other realm of criminality of Trump Organization, and it's extraordinary that this individual was president. So the people he admires, the Putins, the Erdogans, that's what he wants. He wants to have that kind of power. And if he comes back for a second term, he's going to move very quickly to try and get it.
Yeah, not going to happen. But Ron DeSantis is no better. And this is something else I don't understand about the Republicans. I may not try to understand it really, but it has to do with the spread of authoritarianism. And you can help me with this too. I mean, look, I agree. Donald Trump is like every poster child for authoritarianism. He fits right with everybody else in that history. But why does that spawn a DeSantis as his closest challenger rather than a Republican who's right of center who says, this isn't America, this isn't who we are, this is what we want? It didn't spawn that. Great. It spawns more of the same.
It's a great question. Sadly, it's two things. One, the GOP, which is the mechanism that supports these people to become the candidates, is now an authoritarian entity. It is an authoritarian party. It's hard for some people to believe that, but everything it does says, and indeed there are comparative politics studies by political scientists that show not only its platforms, but the way it acts. For example, none of them have had any remorse for the coup attempt of January 6th. So their views of power as well as their platforms compare not to any democratic party, and I mean that party in a democracy, but parties of Erdogan, parties of Modi, authoritarian parties. That's who they are today. So that's one thing. So they're not going to support a Liz Cheney. They're not going to support an Adam Kinzinger. Those people had to leave. Who's coming in? More and more lawless people. So that's part of it. The other thing, which is very interesting, a kind of big picture thing, is when you have somebody like Trump, who's, we said before, extremely criminal, loose cannon, talking about shooting people, some people get tired of that, and they don't want all the chaos anymore. And so here comes an opening for someone like DeSantis, who's equally extreme, but he's too smart. He would never say, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone. He's not going to do that, DeSantis. So he seems, quote, more normal and disciplined, but he's not. And we saw this in the Philippines. We had Duterte, who was, talk about a loose cannon. He was constantly saying, I love to throw people out of helicopters. I'm going to kill all of you. Crazy stuff. So people got tired of that. And who do they have now? The Marcos family, which were actual dictators, martial law. Yes, but Bongbong Marcos, who's now the head of state, he doesn't bluster that way. He wears a suit, and he's like the DeSantis. He seems, quote, normal, even though he's very extreme. So that's a syndrome that I watch, foreign politics and see what applies to our case. And unfortunately, this business with Trump and DeSantis, that's how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time in the 20th century, but there was a fellow named Heydrich who, seemed a little bit less loud than Adolf Hitler, but he was enormously efficient in doing terrible things.
Yeah, that's the type of, there was the Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister, and also he was constantly giving speeches, and he was rather blustery himself. And Heydrich was, eventually put in charge with others of extermination, and he was like kind of quieter bureaucrat, but equally ruthless, equally extremist. That's, Hannah Arendt in Origins of Totalitarianism and other books, talked about the danger of the kind of the bureaucrat, the bureaucrat exterminator, the bureaucrat violent person. And under Trump, we had Stephen Miller, faceless, boring looking. So you had Steve Bannon, who was out there. He's like disheveled. He's an extremist. And then you had his protege, who's also Jeff Sessions' protege, Stephen Miller, who was the architect of the immigration, right?
Ripping kids out of their parents'
real
arms.
Extremist. Yeah, but he speaks quietly, stays out of, and he wears a suit.
Yeah. I just finished teaching a class on some of the threats to American democracy, and Hannah Arendt, because it's college, figured into that. And one of my students said, America's better than that. We really aren't living in her time. This is not a country that will fall for mass propaganda because there isn't a mass in America. We're too diverse. And the diversity here is what's going to save us. I thought that was lovely, but I wonder what you think about that.
The mass is there, and it's the 40 million who believe Donald Trump and continue to believe, that he won the election and all of the other lies. So there is always that kind of mass, and social media has made it more easy to get that coherence. That it speeded up everything about propaganda. But your student's right in that what the GOP is doing is a reaction against what we are, which is a multiracial democracy. And we can be a model for the world of a multiracial democracy. And they know that, and that's why they're trying to take it away. But I do believe we've seen in Tennessee, and now there's a protest going on in Florida. I believe you're going to see another round of mass protest in America because we are a nation built on protest. And we had the largest two in our history was Women's March then Black Lives Matter. We forget about the Women's March. These were the largest in American history, each of them. So we'll see what happens.
I'm cautiously optimistic, but this virus that we're fighting is real, and you have done, I don't know, more than anybody to help educate week in and week out in your Substack, Lucid, which everybody should read or join because you do more than write. When you go on television, when you come on shows like this, it's just a gargantuan effort to wake everybody up in time. And I am so grateful to you that you are willing to do it in and out and time again, because, there are 300 million of us and change, and we learn slowly, and hopefully not too slowly.
It is a big country. It's service to, I'm a first generation American. I love my country, and I have the skill set from studying fascism and now authoritarians everywhere to be able to do this. So that's my service to my compatriots.
It's really great. I am a fan. I really appreciate it. And I know every time you come here, it's really helpful. Really helpful. Oh, I'm sorry. I want to ask you one more thing. I know we're running out of time. The first time we talked, you told me the way to stop this was to hold them accountable, was to put them in jail, right? And then it begins to weaken the thread. And I never forgot that. But it does look like we are, Mr. Trump is in very serious legal jeopardy. He's been found guilty. His Trump organization has been found guilty of fraud, tax fraud, and he's been found liable for sexual assault and lying about it and defaming somebody, and he's under other legal jeopardy, defamation, right? And I just think he's going to be running for office while he's on trial for big criminal charges. Is this going to begin to weaken the hold? Or is it just going to make way for Ron DeSantis to step right in and pretend that nothing's changed?
At the beginning, it could boost his support because he's got this whole victimhood complex that he's taught everybody for years that he's a victim and the blame of the deep state. And we've already seen he's been through so much. He's been through a lot. And his supporters will say, "Oh, he's been through so much. I'm not going to give up on him now." So at the beginning, it could have no effect in terms of it could even make more people vote for him within the cult. But in the long run, if something, if he gets convicted of something, I mean, let's just say that I'm sure Ron DeSantis and his crew are eagerly monitoring the news, anything prosecutors like Jack Smith are doing, hoping fervently that Mr. Trump will be sent off somewhere and then he can just step in and be the king.
Yeah, isn't it interesting, these would-be autocrats who don't give a fig about the rule of law are hoping that those of us who do care about the rule of law will pave the way for them. We aren't that stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really, again, am very appreciative, and I look forward to our next talk.
It's a pleasure.
Okay. Well, everybody, that's Ruth Ben-Ghiat, the professor of history and Italian studies at NYU and prolific author and a true patriot when we need it. We're going to take a break, and then guess what? It's time for me to hear from you at 773-763-9278.